the early hours of Saturday the 29th of April 1944, PT Boat 347, captained by Lieutenant Robert J. Williams, alongside PT Boat 350, captained by Lieutenant Stanley L. Manning, were on a routine mission to intercept enemy traffic around Cape Pomas in the South Pacific, with orders to destroy enemy barges, ships, and shore installations wherever possible. Both had departed that morning from USS Hilo, the flagship PT boat tender in the South Pacific, and began patrolling the Rabaul coast in Lassell Bay of New Britain, the largest island in the Bismarck Archipelago and part of the islands region of Papua New Guinea. Orders were to operate during the dark early hours and return to base by sunrise, yet with the boats having limited visibility, they would soon turn into trouble at around 2 a.m. when PT 347 became stuck on a reef, rendering itself immobile. Unable to move, PT 347 requested the help of PT 350 to dislodge them from the coral and get them back on track. PT boats were known for getting stuck alongside shorelines and shoals in the Pacific, and in fact, many boats were lost to reefs then to enemy fire during the war. PT 347 looked to be suffering a similar scenario, with Lieutenant Manning spending almost 5 hours attempting to pull the boat away, and with the sun rising just after 7 a.m, the two boats were in danger of being exposed and clearly visible in the daylight. The location of Williams and Manning's boats was unique in the fact that it was just 3 miles from the line of demarcation, which divided the Pacific Ocean into 2 different areas of command. The PT boats were commanded by General MacArthur of the Southwest Pacific Command, whilst the South Pacific was under the command of Admiral Nimitz. The authority for the war in the Pacific was shared between these 2 commanders, which ultimately led to miscommunication and, in some cases, disaster. Whilst PT 347 and PT 350 continued to struggle, another mission had begun under Nimitz's command, with 4 US F-4U Corsair fighter planes making their way west of New Britain to strafe various targets along the shore. Led by Major James K. Dill of the US Marine Corps, the Corsairs were one of the most heavily armed and fastest planes at the time, with speeds of over 400 miles per hour. They were dubbed Whispering Death by the Japanese, due to the low-pitched sounds that the engines made. They also had a long nose which made it difficult for pilots to observe directly below the aircraft. As they continued west, one of the Corsairs developed engine problems, and was ordered by Dill to return to base with cover from one of the other planes. This left Dill and his wingman, Lieutenant Edward B. Cochran, to continue along the mission alone. During their journey, Dill and Cochran began heading slightly off course, crossing the demarcation line and heading into Southwest Pacific Command territory, where PT 347 and PT 350 were operating. Despite daily dispatches from Southwest Pacific Command to South Pacific Command of PT boat whereabouts during the war, this information was rarely relayed to air units, meaning that Dill and Cochran had no knowledge of Allied boats operating in the area, setting the stage for disaster. Cochran was the first to spot the 2 PTs along the coast and mistakenly radioed to Dill that they were Japanese boats. Both planes then set course for attack, rising to 6,000 feet where anti-aircraft fire couldn't reach them, and moved towards their targets. The weather was clear and the sea was calm, yet despite this, Dill and Cochran were unable to identify the boats as friendly, even though both were displaying huge 7-foot aircraft identification stars painted in blue and white on their canopies, and American flags flying from the top of their masts. The crews of 347 and 350 began to debate whether the planes were friendly Corsairs, or perhaps Japanese fighters, as they weren't the typical aircraft they were used to seeing. As they moved closer, however, it became evident that they were lining up for an assault, with officers frantically waving around deck and signalling with their searchlights not to attack. With the fear setting in that they had been mistaken for enemy targets, 350 began turning right as instructed for emergency identification. However, before she had managed to complete a third of the circle, the nightmare had begun. At around 2 miles from their target, the Corsairs opened fire on 350, ripping through the deck and shredding through the ship. Assuming that the planes must have been enemy aircraft after all, Manning ordered for 350 to proceed eastward into deeper water and return fire. Radio man William Brick sent a message to USS Hilo stating that they were under attack by 2 planes, before the radio itself took a direct hit and was rendered inoperable. 350 and the Corsairs continued to exchange fire during the single run, and as Deal and Cochrane began pulling out of their dive, one of the gunners aboard 350 landed a direct hit onto his wing, sending the plane crashing down into the ocean. Upon realising his wingman had perished, Deal began retreating back to Green Island Airfield to report the attack. As the sound of whispering death departed further away, the devastating damage left behind by the single strafe was realised. PT-350 lost 3 seamen in the sweep, with 5 others wounded and 7 of the crew left unharmed. The ship itself was almost annihilated, with heavy smoke billowing from the stern and flames rising high as ammunition boxes began exploding. PT boats were powered by 3 modified plane engines, carried over 3,000 gallons of aeroplane fuel, and were loaded with torpedoes and ammunition, making for horrific fires and explosions when they were hit. The boat started taking on water rapidly in the engine room, causing the crew to jettison torpedoes and depth charges to help lighten the load and prevent the ship from flooding entirely. 347 hadn't been fired on during the attack, and therefore hadn't suffered any loss or damage. Lieutenant Williams took a life raft from 347 to deliver medical supplies to the injured on 350. Due to the heavy smoke caused by a puncture to the smokescreen generator, it became difficult for both boats to identify Cochrane's downed and burning plane, with most of the crew now believing that they must have been Japanese Zeros, which is what they reported back to command. Battered and bruised, PT-350 was ordered to return back to base, as the damage sustained to the ship made it impossible for her to continue in her mission, with MacArthur sending out PT-346, led by Lieutenant James R. Thompson, to help aid in efforts to rescue both boats. PT-346 had 21 crewmen on board, including their mascot, an Irish Terrier dog named Chopper. Joined by PT-349, Thompson reached the 2 ships at La Salle Bay and soon realised that PT-350 was too heavily damaged to come alongside to provide medical aid, as the boat couldn't stop without flooding, so ordered PT-349 to escort it back to USS Hilo. Thompson headed out to try and help PT-347 off the reef, and decided to call in air cover from Cape Gloucester as a precaution due to the earlier attack. Ironically enough, PT-346 had already been involved in a friendly fire incident just a month prior, when the boat was attacked during a similar rescue mission on March the 27th by the Royal Australian Air Force. On that day, 8 men were killed and 12 were wounded. As 346 was making its way to the reef to rescue 347 and its crew, Major Dill, still flying his Corsair back to base, radioed to command that his wingman had been shot down by 2 large Japanese gunboats, ordering an immediate attack in retaliation. Upon arriving back at Green Island Airfield, he reported the boats as 125-foot Japanese gunboats, despite PT's only being around 80 feet. He also gave incorrect coordinates of the location of the boats, meaning that when the PT boat schedule for the night before was checked, there was no record of a friendly patrol in the area. Relying on Dill's report alone, Colonel Bailey launched an armada of 22 planes in response to avenge their fallen pilot, made up of 4 Corsairs, 6 Avenger dive bombers, 4 Hellcat F-6F fighters, and 8 Dauntless dive bombers. As the planes made their way to Dill's reported location, they realised they were unable to find the boats, and instead were redirected by Dill to the actual location, beyond the line of demarcation and outside their area of operation. Lieutenant Thompson arrived to 347's location at around 12:30 PM and began working to pull her away from the reef. After an hour of struggling, they began to hear the distant whispers of planes approaching them. Flying in roughly 5 rows of 4 and approximately 10 miles to their location, the crew of 346 observed that the planes were showing American insignias, believing it to be their air cover that they had requested previously. Under the impression they were safe, they carried on trying to dislodge 347 by tying the two boats together, meaning they were now both immobile as the squadron approached. At approximately 2 p.m, Deal and the other planes had begun circling the area at high altitude and lined up for a run. The slow realisation that they were about to be attacked again by friendly planes dawned on the sailors, with Thompson frantically attempting to contact them by radio to no success. Still tied together and unable to move, the crew of both boats desperately waited for a response. But that response would never come. Despite being covered in American flags and blue and white stars, the planes made no attempt to identify the boats and had only one intention. The planes began their strafing run and first targeted 347, hitting not only the sitting duck, but also the reef which had trapped them all night, blowing coral all over the boat. 347 began shooting back at the planes, firing several shots before taking more hits from above. Knowing that they were completely mismatched in firepower, Williams ordered the crew to abandon ship, saving as many lives as he could in the few short moments they had, while several direct hits by bombers rained down onto the deck. Seaman First Class Raymond Janou refused to abandon ship and was the first casualty aboard 347 after taking a direct hit from a bomb. Gunner Wilbur Larson also stayed aboard the ship, firing his 20mm gun towards the onslaught above, and was one of the last to evacuate the boat. Carpenter mate Forrest May managed to get off the ship and onto the coral, but had become injured in the attack, with his thumb hanging off his hand, holding onto it with the other. Unable to swim or hold onto anything, he yelled at Larson in desperation for help, to which the gunner got up and made his way over to him. Shortly after, PT-347 succumbed to its own injuries and eventually blew up, with several explosions and gas fires incinerating the ship, causing it to slowly disintegrate into the water. With the remaining crew of 347 now overboard and the ship destroyed, the planes began lining up for another strafe, this time to finish off the survivors. Larson, now in the water holding on to May, helped keep his crewmate afloat by also holding onto a life jacket, ducking and diving underwater whenever the .50 caliber bullets came barreling towards them. Lieutenant Williams ordered his men to remain dispersed in the water, to put their helmet on their life jackets and submerge into the blue as the planes made their runs. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Thompson, still aboard 346, continued to make attempts by radio to identify the boats as American, but still he received no response. He set his men to general quarters, the order given to signal for all crew members to be at battle stations ready to attack, but no order to fire was given. As the planes started to line up for a run towards 346, sailors aboard the ship began waving frantically for them to stand down, with Lieutenant James Burke placing himself personally in the direct line of fire to hold up an 8-foot American flag. Some pilots would later say they saw these flags, but believed it to be a trick by the Japanese to force a retreat, so continued with their attack regardless. As the planes made their first strafe along 346, the first shots hit Lieutenant Burke, holding up his country's colours in a final effort to cancel the attack, mortally wounding him. Thompson rushed to the ship's wheel, whilst another officer fired recognition signals. The first bomb was a close miss, but put 346's engines out of commission and started a fire. Ammunition crates began to explode as shells hit the deck, with guns themselves being completely blown from their mounts as the artillery came down. Chief Pharmacist aboard 346, John Verkovich, aided Lieutenant Burke by providing a shot of morphine to ease the pain from his fatal injuries. During this time, bombs were exploding all around the boat and the planes were strafing the crew. Verkovich put a life jacket around Burke, who, realising he had little chance of surviving, ordered Verkovich to take it for himself with his last breath. Many of the crew members would later go on to say that none of them were surprised by Burke's unselfish acts that day, as he was a great man who would have done anything for his men. 346 had begun shooting back towards their allies at this point, including gunner Bob Mills, who fired from the forward 20mm machine gun. Thompson, failing to give up on the idea of identifying the boat as friendly, made one last valiant effort throughout the gunfire alongside Verkovich. He cut the large colours from the mast and stood up in the day room in clear view of the planes, with Verkovich holding the other end. The planes approached within at least 200 yards of the sign, which was once again met with a barrage of machine gun fire instead. At this point, all guns aboard the deck of 346 began to open fire, realising that they may never be able to prove their innocence and stop the attack via friendly means. They had to knowingly shoot their own countrymen in order to survive. They managed to shoot down one of the Hellcat fighters, piloted by Lieutenant Knight, but this seemed to only make the situation worse for the sailormen. Bombs rained down from above as the squadron attempted to destroy 346, with the boat rising out the water entirely from bombs exploding beneath it, setting it alight and bursting its hull into flames. Several men were flung into the water, including Verkovich, with some not equipped with a life jacket. Thompson ordered the crew to abandon ship, but the roars of fire and exploding torpedoes on board made it almost impossible to hear. Lieutenant Williams of 347, still floating amongst the wreckage of his own ship, watched on as the boat that came to rescue them had perished to the hellfire that was supposed to be protecting them. With both boats now completely destroyed and the remaining survivors spread out in the water, Hill's squadron continued to strafe, finishing off what they started. As each passing run was made, the men of 346 and 347 slipped off what life jackets they had and submerged underwater until the planes and bullets passed by. Several sailors reported that the fighters flew so low at times that they could see the pilots' faces and could recognise their features if they saw them again. Yet for some reason, they could not do the same in return. The continual submersion required too much for some of the men, such as John Dunner of 347, who eventually drowned. Nobody could say for sure if he had been hit, but he became the second casualty of their crew as he sank to the bottom of the Pacific. The planes continued to make run after run for almost 2 hours, bombing and spraying the water with shrapnel. Robert Valentine of 347 recalled his life jacket being shot to pieces, resorting to a smouldering mattress floating in the ocean instead when the next wave of attacks came in. The bomber planes eventually pulled away, but the fighters continued to burst fire on the men below as they watched helplessly in horror. One by one, as they submerged under the waves, they would resurface to find some of their friends never coming back up for air. Several of the survivors reported Lieutenant Colonel James B. Petit being shot through the lung before being decapitated by gunfire, while Seaman First Class William Neil Waters was directly hit by a bomb whilst in the water. After 2 grueling and scarring hours, the planes eventually decided to leave, nobody knowing for sure why they were the lucky few to be spared. Motor machinist, First Class Ollie J. Talley, believed his prayers were answered that day, as he prayed that if the Lord were to make it rain, perhaps these planes would go away. Despite it being a clear blue sky day, rain did come, and without radar, the planes couldn't safely continue their strafing runs. Despite not believing in God at the time, Talley was convinced that this was a holy miracle, and became deeply religious after the event. As the whispering death grew quiet, the survivors slowly drifted towards their life rafts. The reality of the catastrophe could now be realised, as all surviving crew members were now able to witness the devastation of the attack. 14 PT men had died, including Bob Mills, the gunner who was firing on the forward machine gun, dying on the life raft from his injuries. 17 of the remaining crew were wounded in some way, with only Verkovich and motor machinist Frank Burns walking away unscathed. Even Chopper, the Irish Terrier dog aboard 346, suffered shrapnel wounds to his face. One of the 2 pilots, Lieutenant Cochrane, also died, bringing the total number of friendly fire deaths that day to 15. PT-346 and PT-347's crew ended up in different locations on different life rafts and did not know the fate of each other until much later. They both continued to float in the waters of the Pacific for another 90 minutes, whilst the voices of the Japanese soldiers, who had been watching the events from the surrounding shoreline, could be heard as they laughed at the self-sabotage that had just unfolded before them. At 5 p.m, more fighter planes, alongside a Catalina plane, returned to the scene of the battle to look for the downed Hellcat pilot, Lieutenant Knight, who managed to survive his crash in the ocean. Realising this may be their only hope of finally being rescued, the crew of 346 fired flares and waved their shirts in the air to identify as friendly. Despite not being recognised as American throughout the whole ordeal, this time, thankfully, the Catalina managed to successfully recognise the PT men as Allied sailors. PT-346 were rescued by the Catalina, who dropped a 15-man life raft for 347 to be rescued later that evening. It wouldn't be until 10:30 before two more PT boats, PT-351 and PT-355, would eventually arrive to take the survivors of 347 back to the USS Hilo, returning to base at 5:30 a.m. the next day, where they could finally rest and recover from the worst 27 hours of their lives. The next evening, on April the 30th, 1944, back at the base where USS Hilo and her PT boats were stationed, the few recovered bodies of the tragedy were buried by their comrades. Dusty Rhodes, a cook aboard the USS Hilo, summed up the events of the burial in his diary.
The PT men just straggled off, looking all around the place as if they had entered another world and received instructions for the ceremony from the officer. The bodies of our men were loaded onto a truck to be driven to the base of a large, extremely muddy hill we all were to climb. This hill seemed immense. We weren't used to climbing mountains, not PT men. The men carrying the stretchers had a tough time, but they finally made it to the place where 4 shallow graves were dug. The scenery overlooking the bay was beautiful, but marred by the misty, overhanging clouds of death. Our boys, the crews of each of the dead men's boats, lowered the bodies, one at a time, the corpses wrapped in US Navy blankets. There was only silence and grim, sorrowful faces as the bodies entered the graves, followed by the echoing of a dull thud. The chaplain recited his sermon in a low, hardly audible voice, his words ushered out of his mouth like a train pulling out of Grand Central Station. There was an all-hands salute, and the bugler sounded taps, and our boys started shoveling, some fast and furious, others slow but furious, sweat on our foreheads, trickling over our eyes and into the graves, doing what they would have done for us. His toast to the men being buried: may the aroma of peace fill your unbreathing heart, and may it know the great music that is still to be written in this world you so suddenly left behind.
The PT men who lost their comrades at sea were ordered from that day never to talk about the incident, except aboard the USS Hilo, with the memory of their brothers burned into their minds forever. The loss of the men was also difficult for the pilots, who unknowingly took the lives of the unfortunate souls that day, some of whom would have been friends with the victims lost at sea. Upon hearing of the attempts of a cover-up, General MacArthur of the Southwest Pacific Command was reportedly furious with the incident, leaking it to the press to demand an inquiry. Admiral Nimitz responded by declaring that no Marine will be prosecuted or penalised due to this tragic incident. This led to a political battle between MacArthur and Nimitz for overall command of the Pacific during World War II, one which would see MacArthur eventually become victorious. A 4-day formal inquiry into the events found that Major Dill, who led both attacks on the PT crews, made the following errors in judgment. unauthorised crossing of the line of demarcation, leading an aircraft attack against friendly surface forces without attempting in any manner to identify them, and extremely careless navigation. Despite this conclusion, no action or charge was taken against him, and he later retired from the United States Marines as a full colonel. Many of the pilots testified that they had not heard of the line of demarcation or knew where it was, and one bomber pilot even declared that he thought he could hear the PT crew over radio during the attack, but attributed it to his fellow fighter pilots. It was concluded in a top-secret report that the boats took appropriate actions to be identified as friendly, that no attempt was made or time given by the planes for identifications of the boats, and that the boats had no choice but to defend themselves. Major recommendations and changes were made to the rules of engagement as a result of this tragedy, which helped contribute to the future safety of PT men. About a year after the incident, Lieutenant Robert J. Williams, captain of PT 347, was retired from the Navy at the age of 26 after being declared mentally disabled due to post-traumatic stress disorder. Wilbur Larson would go on to be awarded the Navy Marine Corps Medal for saving Forrest May's life and seen as one of many heroes that fateful day. John Furkovich later went on to tell his family that he would not have survived the ordeal that day had Lieutenant James Burke not given him his life jacket after heroically trying to wave off the attack. Of the 50 PT men on the 3 boats that day, 14 were killed, 17 were injured, and 19 survived unharmed. However, no one was untouched by what happened that day. The tragic events from the 29th of April 1944 have long been untold for those brave men, and whilst nothing can bring them back from such unfortunate fates, their memories can live on in the minds of all of us whose freedom they fought for.